Hello, friends of the paranormal. This is your co-host Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist Patty Wilson. Patty, how are you this glorious August day?
Uh, I'm doing amazingly well, and it is beautiful. For those who don't know, it has been in reasonable temperatures and cool nights, which makes sleeping much easier. And so it's been a beautiful, beautiful week this past week.
I wholeheartedly agree. I've mentioned this before. Our listenership has increased again. I mean, it's gradually going up, which is nice considering that we took several weeks off, for different various reasons. If you are watching this on whatever platform, whatever, and if you're not subscribed, please do consider clicking the like whatever, click the subscribe. I'm just having a heck of a time, even though I feel great today. I was having a heck of a time getting my words out. So, everything in the description below, Paranormalist Podcast related. We have email address, which we had somebody send an email earlier this week that you and I talked about, before we started the recording process, and we'll see what's going to happen with that. We've had a lot of other comments on Spotify. We really do appreciate that, and I hope if you're listening to this, you realize that because Patty and I both work full time. I don't get to spend as much time going through those different comments and things as I would like. And then I really have to basically transcribe or copy and paste to send to Patty to get her thoughts about them. So if it takes a little bit for us to get back to you, that's why. But we do really enjoy hearing from you. That's our thanks for doing this, really. So we thank you
Right.
for all of that. And again, I think I'm done talking. So what's our topic for today?
Well, because we've been getting comments,
Mhm.
there were some that we have gotten to, and others we're working on getting to right now. And there was a person who had asked me about some of the most frightening experiences. And I'm going to spend a little time on those. You will find some of these stories in other past podcasts, but as our listenership is growing, I'm going to ask the long time listeners if they'll be patient with us as we go back and tell a few stories from the past and catch other folks up. So I have to tell you, to answer your question, I don't often get frightened. It's not a common thing for me. And I think that's because I've been at this forever. And, you just kind of build up a tolerance. But there are a few things. The first time I ever worked an exorcism case, that turned out to be something that I was very uncomfortable with. And I don't have a clear ending yet. And somehow I still believe that somewhere down the line, I will meet this person yet again. So let me tell the story. I was um, doing paranormal investigating. After the writing the books, I started doing paranormal investigating. Was contacted by a friend who is an investigator in another state, and they said, "Hey, there's this case. We think it's a serious haunting. We'd really like it if you could go out and check on them." And they managed to get us to connect. This was the most difficulty I have ever had in my life talking to anybody on a phone or, getting a hold of somebody. It started from the very beginning. I would call the number and it would be not in service, and then I would call it like an hour later, not in service, and then I'd call it, it would ring 3 times, and then just cut off. And so finally, I called the operator and I said, "Look, this is back in the day of the landline. I'm like, there's this number and I think it's going through part of the time, so it can't be disconnected. Can you at least verify if the number is active?" And she's like, "I can do that." And then she said she could connect me. She tried for an hour and a half. God bless this lady. And she'd just get to that point where we would get like a hello or it would start ringing. And she's like, "Oh, this looks like it's going to all go through today, right now." And bam, it was gone. So it took forever to connect with this person. And it was actually her friend that ended up connecting with, the person who had written the original letter to the person in another state. And she was telling me that she was staying with this woman and her husband, and that this woman was struggling, that she had this ghost that followed her. And She was very worried because she thought this thing was going to physically harm the woman and that it had already emotionally and traumatized her. So, with that in mind, I gathered a couple of my investigators and I made arrangements to go there. I verified with the husband of this woman, which also took some time, that it was okay to come because obviously I'm not just going to take a friend's word that it's, oh, you should just drop in at their house. This was very early on, within the first maybe year and a half of investigating. We get to the house on the appropriate day and time, and it's in the middle of the woods. It's like a little 4 or 5 room, 2 floor house, and it's odd. Like it's early spring, Marchish, so there's still puddles of snow all around. It was just beginning to warm up enough you might crack a window for an hour in the afternoon, and the door is hanging open to the house. And there's nobody there. We can hear a dog barking and carrying on. The inside door was shut. The outside door is just swaying and banging in the wind. So I call into the house. I hear the phone ring. Then I hear this dog going crazy. And the phone gets picked up and sat down in the holder that would, cause it to connect and disconnect. So I'm like, that's weird. Okay, maybe the dog jumped and bounced and bumped it. So I call it again, and the dog goes insane again. I'm like, wow, that dog really doesn't like phones. Like I have no clue what I'm walking into at this point. And then the phone gets picked up, and you hear it thud against the floor as though somebody picked it up and dropped it. And then the dog goes dead silent. And like we're waiting and we're waiting. I'm calling the friend, no answer, no answer. After an hour and a half of waiting, we decide to leave and go home. So we're on our way back home. This drive was a 2.5 hour drive one way. So it was a significant time commitment. We're almost back home when the friend calls and says, oh, please tell me you haven't left. And I'm like, of course we've left. And she begins to tell me that about 40 minutes before we got there, her friend, this young woman, I'm going to call her Michelle, that Michelle was suddenly had this asthma attack, and she's not got asthma, so they couldn't explain it. And then it got so bad that she was gasping. She was like losing her consciousness, and they had to call an ambulance, and the ambulance didn't come fast enough. So her husband rushed her to the hospital, and that's where they've been. And after they got off of the property, things began to ease. So my thought is there's somebody possibly who doesn't want us there. So we go through all of this. We go back on another scheduled day. We meet this young woman. She's a very pretty young woman. She had been a nurse. She was no longer a nurse, and I would come to understand why. And her husband was very devoted to her, and she was a very interesting character. She would hold your hand and tell you, thank you so much for coming. I really need your help. And then 2 minutes later, she'd scream, get the hell out of here. Just get out. And then she would stop, flip back to that first person and say, no matter what I say, no matter what I do, please promise me you won't let me alone with this. Please. And she's in tears. So at that point, I have a background in mental health. So I'm beginning to think maybe she's a DID, multiple personalities is the common term. And this continues. We go a couple investigations. We had some very odd things the first 2 nights there that were a little unnerving. We had a investigator who had not, unbeknownst to all of us, had put a blessed cross on herself, and she had the pants tucked, the shirt tucked in the pants and all that. Yes, this cross was removed from her, still knotted. It was knotted on a leather thong, and was hung on the back of the door of one of the rooms in there. And as she was looking for her cross, we began to hunt the room. And then when we shut the door to look behind it, we found it just swaying there. How it got off her head without her knowing, I don't have an answer to this day for. We also had a figure, not the top half, just the bottom half, with blue dress pants We had an investigator go up the stairs, another investigator was coming behind. So the first investigator was probably 2/3 of the way up the stairs. The other one comes rushing up to like catch up with him and freezes and she just catches the way the stairs were built. You would have just caught the bottom half of the person. And she says, "Oh, Charlie, who's with you?" And starts up the stairs, realizes it's just the bottom half of a man, and then it fades away. And she's really rattled by this. And so those are the kind of things that were going on. However, things got really intense whenever we were interviewing the woman. You could see her physically change. So let me explain. She would put on weight, and I mean significant, 30, 40 pounds. She would, her, she was a young woman, straight backed, but she would haunch over and she would grow a goiter. For those who don't know what it is, if you have a thyroid condition, sometimes you'll grow a goiter. It's this big lump and it's extremely visible. And this was large.
Yeah, just like
And
a frog expanding its throat. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, that's exactly what it looks
Mhm.
like. And and it's a terrible thing. And then she would do things like speak about herself in the third person. So for example, there's one night we're interviewing her I'm interviewing her at the table while the investigators are doing their stuff. We're still playing Ghost Hunter and really didn't realize at that moment I was beginning to seriously suspect that I was in way over my head because I was only there at it a year and a half. So I I had a friend of mine who was a medical doctor, and I asked her to come along and just introduced her as another one of the investigators, and she was going to like help with the interviews. And this girl, Michelle, is sitting there, and they have this beautiful yellow dog. And the dog just absolutely adored her. But there were times I began to watch the dog because when she'd flip personalities, the dog would back away and go and hide. When she was in her normal personality, dog just loved her, was right there at her feet the whole time. When she began to flip from personality to personality, which is what I still thought it was, the dog would just like back up. It literally backpedaled away from her and then skittered away and hid. So, and now I have to tell you, in DIDs, people don't normally put on, weight or grow goiters or stuff like that. It's usually just splinters of a single psyche that have been separated out to protect the central psyche from whatever damage due to trauma. And there would be a series of traumatic events she encountered as a child, which she would eventually tell us about. But when we got the video home from that particular night, there's this moment where she says to her husband, "Did you get what I told you to buy?" And he goes, "Oh crap, I forgot." And she looks right back at her husband and she says, "You never listen to her when she tells you things. You just totally disrespect her." And it's very angry personality. And it's not talking. It's like you could see her saying, "Hey, you never listen when I talk to you." But it wasn't. It was a third party type of situation, as though it was somebody else talking about this whole thing. So we got home that night, we watched the videos, and we realized that she put on significant amounts of weight, that the goiter had come out, and it was not just my observation. We now had it on video. And I reached out to the original person and I said to him, "Look, this is what's going on, and I'm pretty sure this isn't a haunting. This is something completely different." And he talked to me and he's like, "Look, I've done this a lot of times." This guy was much more mature in the field than I was. He's like, "You're going to have to be my eyes and my ears, and you're going to have to do the legwork." And I was like, "Oh crap, I don't know about this." And, hey, I wasn't that brave, but I was also willing. So I went ahead and I talked to my team. I talked to my sons. My oldest son would have been about 19 at the time. And I had a conversation based upon what was occurring, that my sons needed to be pretty careful, not invite anything bad into their lives at this point. If anything happened, I need to know about it, because we're going to weigh this against something coming into my home after my kids. If that's the case, the whole damn thing gets scrubbed and somebody else is going to have to deal with this. And she has described a nightmare she's been having since she was a little girl. She's sees a man sitting on the steps of a little abandoned church. She's walking down the road. She comes up to the man and he yells, "Come here." She gets closer. She can see his face is rotted, and she starts to like to back away, and she screams and all this, and he starts coming after her, and he pursues her, and then she would wake up. So we're like 3 weeks into this, 4 weeks into this. I am now actually entertaining the idea of participating in an exorcism for the first time. So we had contacted a couple ministers. I began to do a crash course on how does one survive an exorcism and help that person. And I'm working on all of that, still reaffirming with my kids, you got to be good. And then this is what scared me. This is why I'm telling you this part of the story. It's a long story, very involved. I could take an hour to tell it because there was that much going on. But anyhow, my 19-year-old son walks in. He's a big, tough-looking kid, and he sits down and he says, "I am so tired." He's on the floor beside me, sitting, and he puts his head against my leg and he says, I can't sleep, Mom." And I said, "What do you mean you can't sleep?" And he's like, "I've been having this crazy ass nightmare. I'm walking down this road and there's this old abandoned church. There's a man sitting on the steps and he yells for me to come over. And when I get close, his whole face is all rotted and he grins at me and he gets up and I take off running and he starts to pursue me and I start looking around and there's others and they're all pursuing me and I know one of them's going to catch me." That was exactly that woman's dream. She had told it to me a week and a half earlier. And so I ended up reaching out to a very religious, very faithful person, faith-oriented person, who he ended up going to stay with for a few days and getting some assistance to get that away from him, and the nightmare eventually ended. That is the first time that my ghost hunting really ever came home with me. And it really wasn't ghost hunting, it was a demonic possession. We had two ministers who attempted to do an exorcism, and both of them left the building at different times saying, "I will never go back there again." And so I ended up working the case. And then I said, there's no disposition to this story. And the reason there's no disposition to this story is because I was trying to get a hold of her to arrange yet a third time to go down to try the exorcism. And I get no answer. The phone's disconnected. Everything's gone. Now, these people had involved lives. He had a responsible job, that kind of stuff. So I literally drove the 2.5 hours down there and I see the house is completely empty. It looks like everybody's moved out. There's a for sale sign in the yard. And I call his work and just say, "Hey, I just needed to and get in touch with this man." And they tell me he never showed up for work. Like he just abandoned the job. And it's a significant job that made a lot of money. And so I called the realtor and I said, "Hey, can you help me to connect to these people? You don't have to give me their information, but could you pass mine on to them and tell them I'm still looking to talk to them?" And she says, "Oh my, he signed everything over to his grandmother. She's handling it, but I can let her know." And that's where it ends. I don't know what happened to them. They literally packed up overnight and disappeared. And it has left me to this day rattled. I know that I'm coming face to face with that entity, that I don't know if I was getting close enough that that entity got angry and upset because her periods of demonic activity seemed to be increasing, or if it just won the day and took her away. But she's never really very far out of my thoughts to this day. And it was very frightening. There were moments that were very frightening. Moments when she would be herself and she'd start to cry and beg for help. It may not sound frightening to you, but I could handle the spooky crap. But the fact that I couldn't reassure the real person inside of her was terrifying to me. I couldn't reach her in that tangible way. So that was the first time in my life as a paranormal investigator. I was pretty upset. There's a story from West Virginia, and that was the only time in my life I allowed something to enter my body, and I did so to protect some some teenage girls, and a young man who was there. And it was probably the longest, most miserable night of my life. So basically, a friend asked me if to go down and help her niece who was living in a house in West Virginia near one of the schools. And it was like a big old farmhouse type thing with which had been split into two halves, and you rented a bedroom and common space downstairs. And there was a whole group of them, like five girls on one side, two girls on the other side. And I went down again anticipating a ghost, and very quickly realized this was not a ghost. This thing was targeting certain people, and it was playing head games. So demons, demonic entities don't present as demonic entities at the beginning usually. For those who don't know, they present as something with pathos. They want to be a woman looking for a baby, or a small child looking for their mom, or something like that, that you have empathy for. And then out of that empathy, and there's multiple of these stories I could tell you, you say stupid things like, it's okay, I'll be your mommy, or it's okay, you can stay here with me until your mommy finds you. And it sounds kind because you think you're holding the hand of a little child. You're being kind to a child who's lost. But then eventually the quality of what happens changes. And that's what was going on here. It started out that way. And this was intense. This all took place in 1 week. And that was one of the things that was a little disconcerting. And the fact that this thing ended up smacking into me, and I had to have a friend of mine who was a priest and a couple other friends who were also highly thought of in the field help me get it out. I can tell you it is like nothing I've ever experienced in my life. You could literally feel something else moving through your body. It was, and I cried. The one thing I remember is I was so immensely sad. I cried the whole way home. I cried. I didn't go to my house that night. I was afraid to take it to my home where my kids were. I slept in my car down the road. And in the morning, I called Charlie, one of my friends, who was one of the people that I could trust. And I told him what was going on. And he kept saying, "Come here, dear. You need to come here. I'll help you." And I kept saying, "I can't take it to you. I can't take it to you." Like I felt so lost and alone, like I couldn't get help because if I took it anywhere, it would hurt somebody. And he talked to the friend of ours who was a priest, and they convinced me to go to his house. His would be the best because he was by himself. There were no children, nothing to be harmed. And they helped me to get it out. But I will never forget that experience. It is literally like nothing I've ever felt. I literally felt this thing crawling through my skin.
Yeah, this is not the first time hearing both of those, but every time you tell those, I get the collie wobbles. It's oh, there's something like you. I mean, ghosts are one thing, but
Right.
demonic entity is completely different. And I just don't want any part of that at all. Thank you.
Well, and I never set out for that part. That was not the part I was aiming at. I was just curious about the paranormal, and I love ghost stories, so I wrote books of ghost stories, and um I really it never occurred to me at the very beginning. Now I look back and I think how stupid and young and naive I was. And then I realized that this was my calling all along, and um I can't tell you I like it. I always ask God when it's over, please can we not do this again? And then something presents itself, and I want you to know that God's a gentleman and that He doesn't tell me I have to do it, but something will present itself. And then there's this little part of me that goes, so exactly who are they going to tell if they can't tell you? Who's going to help them? Who's not going to exploit them? Because anything I ever do, you may hear the story, but you'll never hear their names. You'll never hear identifying information. There is no money that changes hands. There is nothing that happens other than I spend a lot of money on gas to get us there. And we do what we do in private and quiet, and everything is completely discreet. So then in those moments, you start arguing it out in your head. And then I hit that moment of, oh crap. I know what to do. I've done it before. how are they ever going to find somebody? I have to tell you, I've had cases where I went through 16, 17 ministers, and every one of them said the same thing to me, in various degrees. And it always basically boiled down to, this is not what I got into the field for. I am not qualified. I used to get very, very angry at these ministers because I wanted to slam the phone on them and cuss them out and, and scream at them and say, then who the hell are we supposed to talk to? But at some level, over time, maturity kicked in. Hey, hope. At 61, let's hope. And I began to understand that there's different jobs that you have to be done. And they simply, they were flock leaders. They weren't warriors. And I don't remember signing up for the warrior thing, but apparently I did at some level because that's where I ended up. And I've bumped into a lot of nasties ever since. Not everywhere by far. I want to make sure that I'm clear about this. I've been in hundreds of places that are supposed to be haunted. I do not believe every one of them are demonic entities. I've seen some really crazy stuff, some really amazing, sweet stuff, and kind stuff. And, there are a couple other cases. There's a case that took place where it really shocked me. It was a place I'd ghost hunted lots and lots of times, but suddenly the one room in this structure, it was a museum, just became completely different than it had ever been before. And so something negative had settled into that area. And I remember backing out of the room that night, and my team was like staring at me with shock. And they're like, "What's wrong with you?" And I'm like, "Too late. I'm too tired. I won't take it on tonight. I have to think. I got to pray. I got to come back. We'll come back next week." So I just kind of told the people there to kind of mark the room as needing some work or something, and just don't let people in there for the next few days. And that's what they did. And then we dealt with it. So those are the stories, that are the scarier ones for me. Like I said, it was mostly frightening in the first story because it came into my home, it came to my son's dreams, not something I wanted. And I spent a lot of time protecting my kids while I was doing this, and feeling that, like, I know there's people that said to me, I can't do this because I have kids. And I can't not do this because I have kids. Because if somebody doesn't take the stuff on, if somebody doesn't utilize the power that we do have, then they get stronger. So that's sort of how I've always looked at it. But there are a lot of really good stories, and there's stories that I can't imagine anybody would think were frightening. There's there's a story about a place in Blair County. It was a private home, and the young woman who told me the story, I will never forget her face. She talked about how her mom and dad broke up, and her grandpap and grandma gathered them all up and took them home. Like, there was like 5 or 6 kids, God love them, and decided to help, raise the kids. And so mom moved back home with her parents, and the kids were there. And her grandfather just was awesome. He was the dad. For several years, he was that guy. He loved children. He took it all in stride. He made time for each of them. There was never a feeling that they weren't wanted in any way. And then he passed away, which was extremely hard for like 8, 9-year-old kids, little ones, to understand. And she said that they would hear the bed springs in the old beds, the old metal ones that creaked and cracked every time you rolled over. And they would creak and crack in that bedroom after he had passed away, and they kept saying, "Is Pap in there?" And then they were scared because Pap was dead, and they were still hearing him roll around on the bed. And it didn't make sense to little kids. And her her mother said, you know how much your pappy loved kids, and if he's there, and I don't know that he is, but if he is, he's not here to hurt you. He's just kind of keeping an eye on us, make sure we're okay. And then she told me that one night her grandmother and her mother both woke up, and they couldn't sleep, and they couldn't tell you why. They just couldn't go to sleep. So they came downstairs, and they were making a cup of tea and talking, and grandma got very quiet, and she's like looking out into the hallway where the steps went upstairs, and standing on the landing was the grandfather's spirit. And he kept pointing out the window and like motioning for them to get over there and look out the window. And the daughter turned, and she saw him too. And then he faded away. So grandma despite the fact she couldn't climb the stairs and slept downstairs, managed to go up the 4 steps, and she could see across the street that there was lights all through the living room and stuff. And it's like the middle of the night, like 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning. And a young couple was living there. They just moved in not too long ago, and they had a baby. And as she's watching, she's seeing the woman going back and forth, holding the baby. A lot. She's on the telephone. She's talking, and she seems to be getting more agitated. You could see that because the front window was open. And despite the fact that today it's probably something most people wouldn't do, Grandma just simply marshaled her forces and walked across the street, pounded on the door, and said, "Dearie, is everything okay?" The girl collapsed basically in tears and said, "There's something wrong with the baby. She's really sick. And I can't get a hold of my husband, and I don't have a car, and I don't know anybody, and I don't know how to get her to the hospital." So they grabbed a car, got her to the hospital. They would later be told that had they not got her there within about 20 minutes of their arriving, she would have been dead. She had a terrible infection. It was causing very high fever, and it could very well have damaged her brain and or killed her. And the woman later asked, how did you know there was something wrong? And Grandma said, my husband told me. And I believe that's a beautiful intervention. And that's the kind of ghost stories I personally like. I'm not a, I mean, I tell ghost stories and some of them are creepy and weird and, what have you. I get that. But I love those stories. I love the stories where the humanity of people is what comes through even at death. And I've had so many of those stories I worked as a CNA when I was young, and I did end of life care, and I just got very close to those types of stories over and over again, where a dead loved one came and walked somebody home and stuff like that. So those were the stories that I liked the most. And so those are the type I usually try to tell. I do try to tell good stories as well, because I think the world's filled with enough evil. And I don't want to give it credence, and I don't want to give it any power and authority over us. So I might tell you a creepy tale here and there, but overall, the stories you usually hear from me, they're more human, because the thing that makes us so precious and special, at least in my mind, is the fact that we have the ability to love beyond life. So, those are some of the stories. I hope I answered the question adequately. Um, Stu, you're always very quiet and you don't tell very much, but you should share a little bit about, you have an interest in the paranormal. It's been abiding your whole life as well.
I do. But before I do that, I'm kind of surprised. I mean, well, I knew that there were several stories that you would tell, and the demonic case I figured would be number one. But again, I don't want to take the liberty of answering for your behalf on your behalf, though.
Mhm.
And out of the other ones, I thought may have been candidates would have been like the Zoot Suit Man.
Oh, well, I never even thought about that because that was
Hmm.
private.
Hmm. Right.
So, so I guess I can share that story real quick. Um,
Oh,
when
if
I
you
was,
yeah, I don't want to
yeah.
force you into that, but I mean, you had
Oh,
told
no,
that
no,
before,
not
and
at
that's
all.
to me
I,
that
I,
sounded extraordinarily frightening because it affected your loved ones as well.
yes. And it was how I learned about generational attachments. So a long, long time ago, when my mother was 17, she wanted to be a missionary. And the summer before she went to college, she took a job working as a babysitter for a family. And so everybody knew her, and another family contacted her and said, "Hey, is there a possibility?" There was a family emergency. Um, I guess a parent or grandparent was sick, something like that. And they didn't want to take the kids. So they hired my mother to stay at the house and, make sure the house stayed nice. The kids were okay. It was summer, so the kids were home from school, so you needed to have somebody there 24/7. And that's what she did. Now, in a lot of old German homes here in Pennsylvania, you'll find a bedroom inside a bedroom. And by that I mean you have a front bedroom, you have a door that goes through the other side of it, and a smaller room in there. So you have to cross through the big bedroom to get to the little one. That's quite a common feature in old Pennsylvania German homes. So my mother was sleeping in the back room, the small room, and the two boys had the larger bedroom. And so one night she woke up in the middle of the night and she saw flickering light, like firelight. And her first thought was, oh my God, the house is on fire. I've got to get the kids out. And she went to sit up, and that's when she saw the figure standing at the foot of the bed. So he was about 5'7". He had blonde hair. His head was down. His hands were in his pockets. And there's something called a zoot suit, very popular in, I believe, Southern California in the 1920s. And it was wide pants, um, cuffed. They're pinstripe suits, and the mobster, the gangsters, the local gangsters wore them, and they had this long watch chain fob, very fashionable. You would, dressed to the nines, and he had a large rain hat on, slouch brim, and he raised his head and he looked at her, and she began to pray. She said, "I knew in that moment it was the devil. I knew it was who it was." And so she sort of dropped back onto the bed and she started to pray, and it began to yell at her, "Shut up, shut up." And she could smell what she would later identify as brimstone. It smelled like when you light a match, that sulfur smell of matches being lit, but very, very strong. And the more she prayed, the more it screamed at her. And it said, "You're never going to be a missionary. I won't let it happen." And it's yelling at her, and she's praying, and she's going, and it yelled silence, and she kept going, and she said, "I'm not going to let you stop me." And he said, "Well, if I can't come for you, I'll come for your kids." And with that, she again into praying, pleading the blood of Christ, and it poofed out. She was really, really rattled, did not sleep the rest of the night. She had never told me that story in my whole life. Now I'm about 18, 19 years old. We move into this old farmhouse. My sister was 4.5 years younger than me. So 14 and a half, 15 years old. And from the moment we move into this house, she and I are both having nightmares. And it took a couple weeks of nightmares before we actually began to compare notes. So I would have the same dream every night that I was going up. There was an built-in, they call them salt box staircases. They're basically built like a cracker box up the steps, and it's all built in. And I would be going up the stairs after fixing the fire in the basement, and I would make myself turn around. In real life, I always felt like somebody was at the bottom of the steps watching me every time I had to climb those stairs. So in real life, I would make myself turn around to look, and nobody was ever there. But in the nightmare, when I turned around to look, he was there, a figure that I've encountered for the first time. And he had the blonde hair, his hands in his pockets, the slouch brim rain hat, and a cape that came down to his knees. And he slowly lifted his head. His eyes were all red, and there were maggots moving through his rotten flesh. You could see the movement. And I screamed and I ran back the hall. I locked my bedroom door with a deadbolt, which is what we had on the doors. And I turn around in the nightmare, and he's right there. And he has this knife, this large black butcher knife, and he raises it up. And I'm literally slamming into the lock, trying to get it to open. It's cutting my fingers. I can feel that. I turn back around, and I would always wake up with the knife hitting my collarbone. And this went on for weeks. My sister's dream was different except for one thing. It was the same man. In her dream, she was standing at the edge of a bedroom doorway looking in. There was this same figure, but he had his back to her, and he was tending a little boy. And as she's watching, she had this impression this little boy was very, very ill. And he picks the pillow up from under the boy's face and smothers him. And she starts to scream, and he rolls his face around to look at her and grin. Same thing, maggots moving in the face, red eye, the whole 9 yards. And then she would wake up. So after a couple weeks of this, she and I are sitting there having tea one morning, and she's like, "Have you had a lot of weird dreams since you've been here?" And we find out we're having different dreams, but about the same person. So when my mom comes home that night, I tell her the story, and she gets very angry with me. Georgie and I tried to explain it really well, and I don't know if we didn't, or maybe we did it too well, because she gets really mad and she's like, "Oh, this is just because you read too many ghost stories and you're dragging all this stuff into my house, and how dare you?" And she's like really mad at me. And then she says, "Go get sheets and go upstairs. You're going to make my bed." Well, my mother never made us make her bed, but I was pretty hurt and confused by the whole thing. So I get the sheets and I follow her up the stairs and she shuts the door. And that's when I first heard the story of what I call the Zoot Suit Man, that being. And she said to me, this is what happened a long time ago. And this is his way of letting me know that he couldn't get me. So he's coming for my kids. And you've got to shut this down because your sister's young and too vulnerable. And she was angry at me because she really did believe that I had provided somehow a channel for it to come in. And maybe I had. I don't know. I was a kid. I didn't know what I was doing. So he stayed in my life off and on for several years. My children, my oldest had seen him multiple times. He would describe him. He didn't know the story until after it happened. And then my middle child, and then my youngest child. And we went through periods of this with each of them, or between 10 and 13 years old is when it would start. And it would go on sometimes for a couple years off and on. It would get almost to nothing and back again. Whatever this being was, he was following, and my children made the third generation. The Zoot Suit Man I learned how to handle. That's where I learned the skills that would eventually convince me to try the exorcism for that lady. And he he is not in our lives. My grandchildren have not seen him. I'm holding my breath. They're too young yet, but I have none of that anywhere around us. None of my kids are having problems. I don't feel him anymore, but I did a lot of work to try to get him to go. And when I never thought about that story, it was interesting because you mentioned it, and I never really thought about that story because I don't know, it was a different kind of fear. Like being afraid because you're afraid for your safety. I was angry at this thing once I figured out what it was. How dare you have the right to come after me? And, first of all, how did you get a right to screw with my mom and then how come to me? But when my kids got involved, that's when I got powerful and I figured it out. So it's, some of the weird things, like my whole life has been filled with weird. It really has. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the books because I found out that my life's not the only weird life. All of us have our moments and our experiences. And somehow over time, people just began to feel like it was safe to talk to me about crazy stuff that most people would tell you couldn't happen. And I learned to not poo-poo any of it. Does that mean I believe every single thing? Absolutely not. Sometimes it's other things, and I connect people for mental health services or what have you, but with great love and kindness because being alone with something, even if it's just in your head, is a horrible feeling. So, gently, kindly, trying to help. I had a lady who thought her daughter was haunting her because her daughter died in a horrible accident. And there was nothing there on multiple. We went to her home 5 or 6 times. And then finally, I had to explain to her that what was going on was in her head and she really needed some help. So we got her connected with mental health and grief counseling. And 6 months later, and we would check on her from time to time. I have this lovely woman named Laura in my group who is the mother of everybody on the planet. And she's that kind of loving soul.
Mhm.
And um, she would like handhold with her for hours at times. And we would just, keep hanging in there. And then finally she said, I feel better now. I now know it wasn't real. And I'm really grateful you didn't take advantage of me. And of course not, so that's just part of being in this weird world where I live. And I think there's a lot of paranormal stuff that goes on around everybody. Sometimes you just don't notice. Sometimes you're just, you've got your blankets over your head so you don't have to see. But unfortunately, I've seen.
Yeah, well, yeah, and you asked, and now I've never been really terrified,
Right.
other than when I was very young. And I've told the stories before about the little dwarves that I would see in the house that my father built. We moved into it, the well, just before Christmas of 1968. So, of course, I was that young. I'm terrified. Same thing. Covers over the head. Things like that.
Sure.
Screaming as soon as you see it. But after having experienced that for so long, I got my resolve that said, that I was going to ask, "Oh, just what do you want?" Because they never said anything. They just stood there and looked, So um, at that point, I was going to say in my academic career, I was leaning more toward, sciences and things like that. So I was always looking for a scientific explanation. And even to this day, whenever I have something paranormal that happens to me, the first thing I look for is number one, a reasonable,
Right.
scientific explanation for it. But I don't really, and I can't say I go out of my way looking for something to be terrified by. I guess that's
Right.
not what I want. But when things do happen, you know, I look at it with a certain degree of curiosity. I mean
Yeah.
that's just this, the analytical nature of how I view things. I mean,
Mhm.
the room where I'm sitting here right now, I've had multiple things that I've seen that absolutely could not be anything else.
Right.
There's a bookcase over here on this side, actually several bookcases dividing this room into half, and to see a head and an arm coming out, that's not a trick of the light. Okay, so that's and it's about 4 feet from the ground. So like, and yeah, I'm getting goose pimples now just thinking about it. The different things that I've seen, but it's and and the very first thing I do was I went over to see, okay, could that have been a light somehow reflecting, and causing that? And
Right.
God willing, I've never had anything terrifying like you have had, and it's not something that I wish on anybody either. But
Yeah.
yeah, really every single experience that I've had, again, I get it's more of a curiosity than anything else. I'm like, well, that's weird. Yeah.
Yeah. So when we investigated, our my team were I had some amazing people. Honestly, they made me look good. They really did, and I thank each and every one of them. I had a team of people who were very clinical and very scientific, and they were running all the equipment and running, shadows and lines of sight, and could cars going down the street create that motion and like all that stuff. Then I had a couple people who were sensitive, and they would quietly walk around writing stuff down on a piece of paper so as not to taint the thing. Laura, along with being mama to the entire world, was a great researcher, and she and I would research property history and maybe come up with some pieces of information that would be like tags to verify things on. So there might be questions that we would ask for EVP sessions and stuff like that. Like, could you tell me who's Thelma? Or whatever, right? And
Mhm.
if the spirit comes back and says something like my wife, well, a woman named Thelma was murdered by her husband in this house. So that's a pretty good clue. It's not conclusive, but it is a pretty good clue that the answer was actually in line with what the historical documents proven about this house. So there's a lot of things. We presented at Durham, North Carolina, at Duke University, and that was one of the things I tried to stress is that you have to go at it from multiple levels. And by the time we got done running angles of light and possible other things, the paranormal event was often over. And then even after that, there would be a series of debates about what it could have been. So, I've just kind of come to the point where, like, I stopped caring about EVP and stuff. Not that I don't think it's cool or interesting or anything, but to me, I've done it for 30 years, approximately. And I realized about 15 years ago that maybe 20, that I wasn't here to collect EVP. I was here to help people. And then I just kind of took the group in that direction. And I still have people who love to do that stuff and they're still there. And if I need them, I can yell literally one time and they'll be available. But I believe at the end of the day, the reason I got to be in the position I was in and people connected to me, they told me their stories, they felt safe, they had some sort of help. Um, and my job's to be able to get through all that so that they get to have their lives back. And I'm okay with that. And if it takes a little bit out of you, I'm okay with that. But I make sure that I try to make sure that those folks get back to whatever normal means to them. But I knew I like people don't you don't talk much about the stuff in your life and like they need to know like you're sensitive, you have had some really interesting experiences. They're not things you're looking for, you're not seeking them out. They just pop out of nowhere for you.
Well, before last week's episode, you and I talked, and it's no secret that Mrs. Stu and I like to go to antique and unique and like consignment stores and stuff like that on the weekends. And last weekend we picked one that the theme of the place was one of the things that Mrs. Stu likes to collect. And I thought, well, let's go do this. And I was so Friday we were going to go Saturday, and Friday evening, as I'm laying in bed, just as I'm about to fall asleep, and I described it to you. I don't know, I don't want to call it a premonition. To me, it was an inkling. That's how
Okay.
I'm going to describe it, is an inkling, and that I could see the place. And the really interesting is, there were some pictures on Facebook that this particular venue had a Facebook page, and so there were a couple of pictures, but there was nobody in the pictures. There was
Mhm.
no other identifying information about it, other than where it was. And so I had this inkling of elderly woman in a blue dress, and she said her name was Betty. And actually, then a little bit later on, she says, "Well, everybody calls me Betty, but it's really Bettina." Now, when we went to the place the following day, now having already seen the pictures of what it looked like, that already sullied my memory. So I got to take that and throw it out. But
Right.
the woman who was running the place, it was exactly what I saw: blue dress, everything. And I was just so shocked at that point. And there were other patrons in the store that I didn't want to ask her name. I
Right.
thought, well, that would be like the icing on the cake. We may go back there, and I may I may just ask her
I've
her
been
name. But
encouraging that idea.
I know, well, it's just about an hour away, and so it's not that far. Yeah, maybe that's that may be a fall trip. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's things like that I've had. Again, like you said, I don't seek them out; they just happen.
Right.
And to me, they're just, what I forget who coined the phrase "happy little accidents." Was that Bob
Yeah.
Ross? Whenever he was,
Yes, it was.
mhm. So yeah, that's how I treat everything, and I really, again, I haven't been really scared since I was really really young,
Yeah.
you know, and knock on wood, hopefully I won't be scared anymore. But well, now that brings I sent you some pictures. There was one other antique store that we went to.
Right.
And even before I turned to look at it, there was a display of like some really old dolls. Some of them looked handmade, hand sewn, everything like that. Even before I turned, I could just feel something just not right. And I turned and looked, and I saw these dolls, and one in particular that I looked at, I'm like, I'm not touching that thing.
Right.
So, and I remember I sent you a picture of it. Even you, I mean, you said they look creepy. Um,
Yeah, like, oh, they're creepy. I don't like dolls. Like, I just don't
Yeah,
like old dolls.
and so because we visit these places with antiques and older consignment kind of stuff, you never know, they might be an estate sale or something like that people had in their homes. They may have died in their homes, and these things go into these consignment shops. You never know what you're going to find. And I mean, you've told some of those stories before.
Yeah.
The pink button down shirt.
Yep.
Yeah, so some other things like that. So yeah, I'm really cautious when we go to places like that. That I really I try to avoid touching things really.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't go to those places in part because like I can feel stuff coming off of the things and I'm like, yeah, I got enough weird in my life already. We're just not going there. And I'm also not a person that collects things, except books.
Mm. And stories, yeah, you collect a fair amount of stories, but
I do. I
mhm.
do. I think of them as treasure hunting. So, so I just wanted tonight to take a little bit of time to answer some of the questions. I know there's more coming. There were a few people who I want to answer more directly because the questions were more personal in nature. But I also wanted to take a moment to thank everybody. I know with great gratitude and love that there are a group of people who have been listening to us a long, long time. Thank you. I know a lot of your names. I am so grateful to have gotten to talk to a few of you, and I feel blessed by you guys. Feel blessed to have Stu as a good friend and to do this with him And for those who are coming and listening and adding to and asking questions, and all of that, thank you. Welcome. We absolutely love you. We may not know your name
Yes,
yet,
thank you. Yep.
but if you need anything or you want to ask a question or whatever, reach out to us. Be a little patient. I got like 9 grandkids and a job, and I try really hard to be a good grandma, um, to give them the childhood I wish I could have had. That's free of all kinds of things that are bad. But I want you to know we love you. I say my prayers. I talk to God about you all and just, ask Him to keep you all safe, keep you all happy. If you need anything, please don't hesitate. Um, it's one of the reasons we're here. And with that, Stu, I'm gonna let you say goodbye first.
Well, thank you. And so how do I follow up that? That was such a lovely soliloquy. So thank you. And thank to all the listeners and good night.
And the reason I make him say it first is he won't let me say it before him. He always tells me I have the last word. So from my heart to all of you, good night.